Morning, y'all. Hey, if you have a Bible, would you open it up with me to Mark chapter 8? Mark chapter 8 is where we're going to be this morning. If you're new or you're visiting with us this morning, welcome. We're concluding a series this morning that we started back at the beginning of the summer, primarily in Mark's gospel, where we're walking through and looking at all of these, we call them curious encounters. These episodes in the life and ministry of Jesus, where Jesus does something, he performs a miracle, he says something perhaps that provokes an intense amount of curiosity, both from Jesus' followers, his disciples, and even from his enemies. And so in each one of these, we've been trying to come to the scripture again with the same sort of perspective. God help us to be curious about the person of Jesus, to never have this settled assurance that leads us to a place where we're dismissive of what Jesus is doing, or where we feel like we've already figured all this out. It all becomes sort of secondhand to us. But instead, to have this humble posture with the scripture, and specifically with Jesus, where we can stay curious rather than moving towards judgment and let him continue to teach us, because after all, that's what we're aiming for at Living Hope. We want to be disciples of Jesus, learners of Jesus, who are continually and constantly growing in our likeness of him and our knowledge of him, but also in resembling him in our character and in our nature. And so we do that again today as we conclude by looking at Mark chapter 8. If you were with us a couple of weeks ago, this particular miracle may sound somewhat familiar. Just a few weeks back, we saw Jesus taking his disciples to a faraway land on the other side of the sea, where he puts them in a position where they don't have what they need to pull off what is required of them. A lot of people were hungry, and so Jesus calls on his disciples to feed them with just a handful of fish and loaves. And once again, Mark's going to record another encounter here where virtually the same sort of setup is before us, where there's a miracle, and Jesus has to multiply loaves and fishes once again. But in this instance, we get to understand a little bit as to why not only Jesus did it the first time, but why he had to do it again the second time. So look with me, if you will, in Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they've been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away. And his disciples answered him, how can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. He directed the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people, and they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said that they also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away, and immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them and got into the boat again and went to the other side. Now, they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why are you discussing that you have no bread? Do you not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand? This is the word of the Lord. Grew up in Oklahoma, as y'all are well aware of by now, hopefully. And there's a certain thing that happens to you growing up in Oklahoma that may not happen if you grew up some other place. We got rather conditioned to storms and thunderstorms at an early age because you kind of have to. I don't know if you're aware of this. Tornadic activity is quite prevalent in the state of Oklahoma. And I just remember as a kid being completely blown away by the resilience of my dad. So there would be a storm brewing. My mom would sort of be in panic. She would be getting us together. My uncle that lived about a half mile down the road had a storm cellar, and whenever a big storm would come, we'd have to go get into his cellar. And my dad, if he woke up during the storm, if he was asleep, just seemed to have zero panic whatsoever about the situation. Every time there was a big storm, he was kind of like, not a big deal. Occasionally, he would get up in the middle of the night. He would slip on his corduroy house shoes and stand in our front yard in his tighty-whities and stare up at the sky to discern what's actually going on in the atmosphere. And so I was always, as a kid, like, man, why is my dad never scared of storms? Me and my sister are sort of in sheer panic. And then I realized, I heard the story later on. We were hanging out with our aunts and uncles, and they were breaking out the picture albums, and there was a picture of my dad's house whenever he was probably 10 or 11 years old. That got just completely obliterated by a tornado. It was just completely leveled. My grandpa drove the school bus, and the school bus and my grandpa's tractor were twisted together like a soft serve ice cream cone, just completely wrapped up. And I thought, that's how my dad developed this sort of resilience. Like, he's seen this. He's seen some stuff. He knows what a storm looks like. And so if it's not bearing down on our house, he's not really all that panicked about the situation. And so over the years, I felt like seeing that and adapting to that. Like, now I'm the dad that, like, everyone else is getting in the closet with, helmets on, and I'm staring out the window like, is this going to be a bad one or not? It's just sort of a condition. It's a resilience. You kind of just get attenuated to the moment. And I think that there's something to be said about that. Like, my mom grew up in California, and she would talk about having to go through earthquake drills at school, like how to prepare for when an earthquake happens. And I thought, we did that for tornado drills in Oklahoma. And depending upon where you live and depending upon what you're exposed to, just over a period of time, you kind of grow accustomed to it. It becomes sort of second nature. And the general panic that sets in with most people doesn't seem to bother you as much. I think that when you look at this particular account in Mark's gospel of what Jesus is doing here with his disciples, this entire miracle is not necessarily about validating Jesus' power. It's not necessarily about showing that Jesus has the power from above, that whenever he cries out to God, God hears his prayer, though it does do that, but he's already done that. Just a few chapters ago, Jesus fed 5,000 people. So what's the point here? Why, if we stay curious about Jesus, why does he do basically the same miracle again? And who's really to be the recipients of this miracle? Who's really to take in and to understand what's going on? And to answer that, I think it's the disciples. I think the whole reason that Jesus once again takes a limited amount of bread and a limited amount of fish and multiplies it is not to validate himself to the world, but to teach his disciples a particular lesson. Namely, that their fears, that panic, that anxiety that sets in when you are in situations where you do not have what it takes, when you are painfully aware of the limitations of your resources, of your abilities, of what you have at your disposal. In those moments, whenever we are ever so prone to be given over to some abject fear, to anxiety, to terror, in those moments, we're beckoned to called upon to trust in the person and work of Jesus. Jesus is exposing his disciples to these moments of anxiety so that he can grow their tolerance and their threshold and ultimately their faith in his ability to provide and to care for them. Now, let me try to prove that to you this morning from the scriptures by teaching you a few things. The first one I want you to see this morning is that these moments of urgency that the disciples find themselves in, these moments of urgency often for us create some measure of anxiety. When we are put in situations, in sets of circumstances where there is something beyond our control, when there are circumstances that are beyond our abilities, beyond our resources, when we don't have the time, we don't have the money, we don't have the energy for this thing, whatever it may be, those moments of urgency put us or often lock us into a state of anxiety, a state of fear, a state of panic, a state of instability. Now, for the disciples, we see that all the way back in chapter 8, verse 1. It says, in those days, Mark opens up with, in those days, when, and here's the key word, again. So So Mark's telling the story. He says, look, this happened a second time. Some scholars who've tried to be, I think, somewhat creative or show themselves to be intelligent have said, Mark's probably just recording the same miracle so that, he can get the point across. No, this is a completely different miracle. This happened again. There's a second time. And in this instance, once again, the people had nothing to eat. So Jesus, here it is, calls his disciples to himself. So Jesus is Lord over the situation. He's not caught off guard by the fact that he's been teaching and there's a big group of people and no one has anything to eat. And he says, I have, here's our word again, compassion on the crowd. Remember back in 2 chapters ago when Jesus performs the same miracle, he again said there that he had compassion on the crowd. But there his compassion was linked to something very specific. Jesus saw the people coming to him and he said, I have compassion on them because they are like sheep without a shepherd. But here Jesus says, I have compassion on the crowd because they've been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. So, quick caveat. This is one way I'm decidedly not like Jesus. Jesus has been teaching for 3 days and not giving anyone a chance to go eat. Think about that. Like some of y'all, we're 5 minutes into this thing. You've already Uber Eats something for lunch. Like you're going to pick it up. You can't make it more than 15 minutes. So Jesus goes 3 days. So the whole situation is a setup for this moment. His teaching, his ministering to these particular people is so that his disciples can learn something and then be exposed to something. And he says, if I send them away hungry to their homes, they're going to faint on the way. Some of them have come from far away. And look at verse 4. Very similar to what happened in the feeding of the 5,000. The disciples answer Jesus and say, how can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? So in these moments of urgency that create anxiety, the disciples say, look at the place where we are. Jesus, look around you. There's not a KFC on the corner up here. There's no opportunity to take care of this problem. And so sometimes we find ourselves in these moments of urgency that lead to anxiety because we feel like we're in the wrong place. See, in the second half of this story, when Jesus is with his disciples on the boat, there Mark says that the disciples remembered that they'd only brought one loaf. And when Jesus talks about the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod, they go into panic again and they say, oh no, we only brought one loaf with us. In other words, we're stuck on a boat and we can't get back to the bread factory. We can't come up with more. And so there's this thing where they feel like they're in the wrong place. They're looking at the circumstances based on their location rather than who they are with. That's a key point. Now this morning, some of you may find yourself in a particular state where you feel like you're unable to act given the situation that is in front of you because of where you are. We say things like this all the time. Man, if we were just in a different stage, if the kids were a little older, if the kids were a little younger, if this was, winter instead of summer, if we were living there instead of here, if I'd stayed in school, if I'd quit earlier, whatever the thing may be, we look at our situation and our circumstances based on our location, and then that urgency begins to set in, which locks us into some perpetual state of anxiety. The disciples say, Jesus, how are we going to feed these people? Look where we are. How are we going to come up with bread? We're on a boat. Their place is determining their posture as opposed to understanding who it is that they're actually with. And then the second way I think that we have these moments of urgency that lock us into anxiety is we realize we have limited resources. One of the ways that we feel the pinch of anxiety is that we recognize how limited we really are. Now, I've lived in a number of socioeconomic climates and now, several decades, times when resources are plenty and times when resources are limited, bull markets and bear markets. And I know one thing for sure, it doesn't really matter what's going on with us financially, it doesn't matter what stage of life you're in, no matter what, we're always going to feel the pinch of our limitation when it comes to resources. Like I remember early on coming out of college thinking if I could ever just make X amount per year, pretty much all of my problems would go away in life. Do you remember that? Like there was a time when you thought, man, if I made double what I make now, my goodness, like I would have no issues, no problems. And then you get that income and you're like, never mind, I was way off. Like it would take at least 5 times this. And maybe you ascend to that level. Then you realize, I didn't realize it would take this much to make life work, to make ends meet. We're always becoming increasingly aware of our lack of resources. And when we do that, when we're asked to perform a task that is beyond our capacity, as the disciples are here, what tends to happen? We find ourselves in a state of urgency. We don't know how we're going to get out of the situation. And that creates in us some perpetual mode of anxiety. Now, here's why that's a problem for the disciples and for us. Here's why Jesus, I think, recreates the scenario, puts them in this position once again where they're meant to wrestle with. What are you going to do when you're in a place where you can't solve your problem? What are you going to do when you find yourself having limited resources and a task that goes beyond the scope of your resources? Because in those moments, what will you do? If you don't address the anxiety, you got to be very, very careful. Because unchecked anxiety can always foster in our hearts unbelief. Jesus has placed his disciples once again, exposed them to this situation, exposed them to a scenario where they don't have the resources, they're in the wrong spot, and he's calling them, feed the people again. Or as you see at the end of this, and at the end of this particular section, when Jesus says, look, are you still realizing that it doesn't matter how much bread you have? When they're on the boat, he says, you're arguing about whether or not you have enough bread. You don't even get the parable. You don't get the point. This isn't about bread. This is about, in this case, leaven. And so Jesus is trying to teach them something bigger. And that's the difference in this particular instance of feeding the multitudes. And the last one is verses 11 through 13, where interjected in there, Mark says that Jesus has this discussion with the Pharisees. The Pharisees, ironically, come to Jesus once again and say, perform a sign. Do something so that we can believe that you are the Messiah. And Jesus, and this is the only place in all of the Bible, this particular word is used, Jesus sighed deep within his spirit. It's like a painful groaning of frustration. Jesus says, you demand a sign, but there will not be one given to you. Now, the irony of this is he's just done, for the second time, an absolute miracle from heaven. Much as God feeding Israel in the wilderness when they didn't have any food and manna came down from heaven, Jesus has multiplied loaves and fishes for the second time, and the Pharisees still can't see it. But then Jesus uses all of this as a setup for what happens next. The lesson to his disciples. If you don't check your anxiety, it will foster in your hearts unbelief. Where do I get that? Verse 14. Now they had forgotten to bring bread. That's the disciples. And they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? What's going on here? Anxiety, the anxiety that the disciples experience, both on the front end, whenever they don't have the necessary resources to feed the multitudes, and Jesus has to once again perform a miracle to show them that he's sufficient. And in this instance, when they realize they've forgotten bread, both of those instances creates a measure of vulnerability. It does in all of us. Anxiety always shows us how vulnerable we actually are. That's the whole point. That's where our internal register is going off on all alarms, saying you don't have what it takes. And when you're in that moment of vulnerability, power and control look really appealing. If I just had more power, if I just had more control. And I think that cryptic message that Jesus says to his disciples here, watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, is about that very issue. When you're in these instances, when you're in a place of deprivation, when you're in a place where you don't have what it takes, when you're aware of your lack of resources, you're in the wrong spot, whatever the case may be, you are uniquely susceptible to be tempted and seduced by this leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod. And what does that mean? Well, as we've seen in this series, the Pharisees and the Herodians, this other group that Jesus is talking about, are on completely opposite ends of the religious and political spectrum. They could not be more opposed to one another. But in the very first curious encounter that we looked at, when Jesus performs a miracle of healing a man, it says that the Pharisees went and conspired with the Herodians, their political enemies, to try to find a way to capture and to trap Jesus and to destroy him. And now Jesus is talking about that they may be on opposite ends of this political spectrum, on the opposite ends of a religious spectrum, but they have something in common. Whatever leaven is, whatever it means in this instance, it's the one thing that they both share. And I think it's specifically about this. They share this temptation to seduce people to believe in them and to trust in them when they feel powerless and out of control. They tempt them to believe, if you just hand the keys over to us, we'll take care of all the problems. The Pharisees are like this first century hyper-conservative religious group where they think that if they could just get all the people to go by the law of Moses to the nth degree, to the traditions of their elders, then eventually the Romans will be run out of town, they'll set up shop, and they'll be able to rule and conquer all things. They won't be in these states any longer where they're anxious about what the future looks like. They're no longer going to be anxious about their location. They're not going to be anxious about their resources because they know that if they can get everyone to just go by every iota of the law, if they can just ratchet that down in everyone's heart and life, then all anxiety will be alleviated. They'll set up shop and God's kingdom will rule forever. On the other end is the Herodians. The Herodians don't have a religious bone in their body. That's what we learned from Herod and his household. They're committing all sorts of sexual deviance, all kinds of crazy political allegiances with the Romans. They just want to maintain the status quo because they believe if they can somehow meld together temple worship and Roman worship, then they would all get along. All of their wildest dreams would come true. They would never lack for resources. They would never be threatened again. All anxiety would go away. And here it is. Jesus is telling his disciples, watch out for that. A very unique temptation that is given to all human beings who find themselves in a state of powerlessness or a place where they have no control, where they realize the lack of their resources, where they feel like they're in the wrong spot. Watch out for the leaven. This mysterious, insidious ingredient that you can't really see that will creep in and corrupt everything if you give into it. Anxiety creates a vulnerability that makes power and control appealing to us. Jesus says these groups may be political enemies, but their driving force is the same. Both groups believe that their agenda will usher in peace and will alleviate any problem that anyone could ever face if you will but just bow down to them. If you will just give them control, they'll hand it back over to you. One of my favorite quotes on this comes from Tim Keller. He wrote on this in his book, King's Cross. He says, here's why the Pharisees refused to believe. They wanted a strong Messiah who would reward them. But Jesus had not come as a Messiah of strength, but as a Messiah of weakness, a humble teacher. Jesus was doing lots of miracles, but they were redemptive miracles. He went about healing people. He wasn't casting down the Romans. He wasn't taking political power and rewarding the good people. He had come as a Messiah of grace to forgive people of sin. The Pharisees didn't see that they needed that. In their eyes, they didn't need grace. As a result, they blame their unbelief on Jesus and say, your whole problem is that you haven't given us enough of a sign. The essence of sin is a proud denial of grace. Both the Pharisees and the Herodians, the leaven, this ingredient that comes in and levels everything, that makes the dough rise. It's this belief that if we just give control over to that controlling group, we'll get it back for ourselves. Because anxiety, like leaven, it always works in unseen ways. Unbelief never walks in and slams the door. It's a million small decisions, usually preceded by some measure of panic in our hearts and souls that doesn't believe that God will be enough for us. Unbelief rides the waves of our chronic anxiety and it whispers lies to us. Those people, your enemies, they will be conquered, but you've got to trust this other group. You've got to believe in them, not in God, in them to deliver you, to bring you through this, to provide your resources for you. There's always this susceptibility that we have that fosters unbelief in our hearts. That's why Jesus tells the disciples, you've got to be very careful with this. When you're in these moments of abject panic, when you're in these moments where you don't have control, the enemy comes and whispers to you. There's a group who will rescue you and who will save you. Their name's not Jesus, though. And what Jesus is ultimately getting his disciples to see by exposing them once again, attenuating them once again to this particular instance of panic, this particular instance of anxiety, is that in these moments when they don't have control and they have limited resources, in these moments, he's worthy of trust. That's why Jesus performs the same miracle. That's why he goes back to the same set of circumstances. Okay, we're once again in backwater country with no good places to eat. And once again, we've got more people to deal with than we have resources for them. And once again, I'm asking you to remember, Jesus says, to go back to what happened last time, to recall that in these instances, I'm worthy of trust, he's telling his disciples. In these moments when you don't have it, when you know you don't have it, I'm setting you up to practice and to put into motion faith in me. Faith and hope and trust in the person of Jesus. That's the whole point of this. Is disciples trust the sufficiency of Jesus. Look back again at the end of this encounter. Jesus tells them to watch out for the leaven of Herod, and they say, wait, we don't have any bread. They completely missed the point in verse 17. Jesus says, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? It's a fair question. Guys, we've been through this. First time, you fed 5,000 people. Second time, you fed 4,000 people, at least, women and children unaccounted for. And now you're on a boat, and you only got one loaf, and right on the coattails of having multiplied twice now, Jesus says, why are you still talking about bread? Do you not get it? It ain't about the bread. The bread is pointing to something. The bread is pointing to something bigger than whatever your resource may be. The bread is pointing to the fact that you've got to trust in me. Jesus says, look, when this happened, do you not have eyes? Can you not see? Do you not have ears? Can you not hear? He goes back and walks through the whole process. When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of pieces did you take up? And they said 12. That's all leftovers. He goes on. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said 7. And he said to them, do you not understand? Guys, do you not get it? It's never been about the bread. The bread is pointing to something else. So how practically, and I'll close with this, how practically do we condition ourselves such that whenever we're in these instances of panic, these instances of fear, these instances where anxiety is tempting us to lay hold of the leaven of the Pharisees or the Herodians, whatever political party is promising us deliverance in this moment, how do we tune our hearts to such a degree to where we see that Jesus is the option here and we trust more in his sufficiency? I think Jesus walks his disciples through it. Look back. Having eyes do you not see, having ears do you not hear, verse 18. Do you not remember? So for a disciple of Jesus, one way that we grow in trusting in the sufficiency of his character, his person, and his work is that we go about remembering. By the way, that's what Sunday is about for us. It is a re-engagement with and a rehearsal of the good news of the gospel. God designed it this way. We are never more than 6 days away from forgetting the fact that we are saved by sheer grace alone. That's why on the 7th day, God rested, and on the wake of Jesus' resurrection on the Lord's day, that the apostles called the church to themselves and taught once again the good news of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Why? Because we have to remember. Remembering, recalling who Christ is and what he's done. It shuts down in our own souls these anxious patterns. Reflecting causes our fear and our panic to be set in the context of God's sovereign care and control over all things. We have to go about remembering. It's why, as we'll see when we study the book of Hebrews coming up in the fall, that the author of Hebrews says, look, don't neglect gathering together as some are in the habit of doing. Why? Because if we fail to remember, if, as Hebrews 12 tells us, we forget to look unto Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, then we will grow weary and lose heart. This is what the disciples find themselves with here. Whenever they're in this second scenario, and Jesus has been teaching for 3 days, and he hasn't given anyone a lunch break, and he says, okay, guys, it's time to feed them. Someone should have, by faith, said, hey, we've been here before. We know what he's about to do. Break out what little bit we have, and let's watch him multiply it. Or even on the boat, after this encounter with the Pharisees, when someone said, hey guys, we only got one loaf and he's talking about leaven, I think we're in trouble. What if Peter, what if James, what if John would have said, really? Yesterday we fed 4,000 people. I think he's going to be able to take care of the 12 of us. I think he's got this. In those moments, we're beckoned to recall and to remember. And not just that, I think we're also beckoned to practice gratitude. Remembering is one thing, but taking the time to consider these are the specific ways that God has delivered. These are the specific ways that God has come through. These are the ways in which, when we look back over our story and over our history, were it not for God, we would have been in a complete and total failure and mess. But God. The but God moments where God showed up and did something. And then that fosters in our hearts some sense of gratitude, where we're no longer left to just stare at our lack of resources. We're no longer left to just spin on the fact that we feel like we're always in the wrong place, but instead we see how God has showed up time and time again and come through for us. And then that's why I believe this last point is so important. How do you foster trust in the sufficiency of Jesus? You understand with your heart. This may not be intentional by Mark, but I think it's really important. The way that he concludes what Jesus is saying here. And he says, having eyes do you not see, having ears have you not heard, do you not remember? Have you grown hard of heart, Jesus says? Do you not understand? So in other words, there's something about understanding the sufficiency of Jesus and our hearts being tethered to that. In other words, it's not just about cognition for disciples, it's also about affection. Has the truth of who Jesus is and what he's done not just rattled around in our brains, but actually seeped into our hearts? The only way to deal with an anxious heart is to have that truth unseated by a better truth. The truth that we've never been left to ourselves. We've never been forsaken. We've never been forgotten. We've always been provided for. That's why I think Mark says, once again, when Jesus saw the crowds, he had what? Compassion. He has always been and always will be compassionate. It's who he is. Compassion is a sympathetic consciousness of the distress of another and a desire to alleviate it. That's what Jesus has. He has a sympathetic consciousness of your distress. In that moment of panic, in the moment of fear, in the moment of anxiety, you are not abandoned. He's aware of it entirely, even more so than you are. And he desires to alleviate it. That only happens by trusting him. It only happens by faith. So God, this morning, would we see these moments as opportunities? The moments whenever we're so prone and so susceptible to the temptation to believe the lies of the powers of the age. In those moments when fear has crept in, when anxiety knocks on our door, when we're face to face with our limitations, God, would you once again beckon us to trust in the person of Jesus? Would you help us to remember, to foster gratitude in our souls for all the ways that you've come through? To take the time to write it down, to pray it, to consider it, such that it affects the tenor of our hearts, the direction of our affections. So that we would be a people who model forth into the world faith that is anchored with patience and with grace and with gentleness and with kindness, because we know we've never been abandoned. You want to alleviate that in our own souls, God, but it comes by trusting in the sufficiency of your Son. And so this morning, even as we come to your table, would you do that for us? In your name we pray, Jesus.